Hi, thanks for coming to the Quirks event session on how to use surveys for thought leadership on a shoestring budget. I am Joe Hopper, and I'm the president at Versta Research. I am talking today about using surveys as a tactic for public relations, which I have never quite done like this before. Instead of spending $30,000 or $40,000 or even up to $175,000 like some of the companies we work for spend on PR surveys, we decided to use some of our time during the pandemic to experiment. We wanted to know how quickly and inexpensively we could actually launch a survey-based PR campaign. Before I jump into that, it's the third day of the event, so you may already know how this works. I really am here right now in my office participating in the event. Through the magic of this online event platform, I am available to answer questions during the presentation itself, so please, as questions come up, ask me through the chat box and I will answer as best I can. Part of the magic of this online platform is that it will not interrupt the presentation, so please do that. No need to wait until the end. Back to surveys for thought leadership. Our inspiration was this. First, it took quite a bit of time before any polling around COVID-19 started showing up in the media. And then once it did, the questions were coming from academic centers, and I found it difficult to use those findings when trying to communicate them in very simple stories. Second, once surveys about COVID-19 started emerging, there were tons of them, including weekly pulse polls, but many of them were not being done well in terms of their methods and how data was being transformed for reporting. And then third, as I started seeing lots of research firms packaging their own COVID-19 studies for PR exposure, I couldn't help but think, if you're a small firm like Versta, it would be hard to recover an investment in a study like that. Even just a one-time poll, let's say it's a 15-minute online survey with 2,000 adults, just the direct cost of buying sample would be $6,000 to $8,000. And of course, it takes time. And in a rapidly changing environment like the COVID-19 shutdown, a lot of the studies I was looking at seemed like outdated news by the time the studies were released. That inspired us to try something totally different. We launched 10 extremely fast snapshot surveys about how Americans were responding to COVID-19. Each used census rep sampling and took just 5 days from ideation to public release. We sampled over 3,300 US adults over 4 weeks. Each survey was published within 1 day of data collection. The direct costs were just $255. I'm going to share with you each of those 10 snapshot surveys and use each one to illustrate an example of the approach we used and the best practice we learned, so that if you decide to do this for your own company, you'll be 10 steps ahead of where we were at the beginning of May. Let's take a look at those snapshot surveys. The first in the series reflects where we started out in our thinking as we contemplated this type of campaign. And it wasn't so much about logistics and how to execute fast and cheap in a rigorous way, but about content. My advice is this: use survey questions to get data that nobody else has. All of the survey questions I was seeing asked things like, have you lost your job? Are you cutting back spending? Have you pulled money out of your 401k? Have you missed a mortgage payment? These are all okay questions if you're doing a traditional PR survey, but there was so much big economic news coming out that these surveys seemed beside the point. What good is a survey asking people if they have been laid off when the Department of Labor is already telling me that 30 million Americans have filed for unemployment? Who cares about the survey? Retailers and credit card companies are reporting all kinds of data on spending, so why ask a survey question about it? What we wanted was to get at the issue of financial hardship, but in a compelling way that only a new survey can, and this was our effort to do that. There are no government or corporate stats like this. And something I really liked about the question we came up with is that it's about people helping each other through hardship, which nobody else was asking either. Another thing about this first question and posting in our campaign is that it reminded me to always have a third party review the content before sharing it publicly. After we put together the workings of the story here, our graphic designer laid out a nice visualization. Initially, the icon showed two clasped hands to highlight the idea of coming together and helping each other. When I showed that to another member of my team, he immediately said, "COVID-19, you can't show people touching." And he was definitely right. Number 2, move fast but not too fast. One unfortunate consequence of do-it-yourself tools is that a lot of people, and many of the marketing or executive teams you work for, now believe that surveys can be done overnight. And it's true, you can get thousands of people going through and giving your answers to your survey overnight. But most of those responses will be junk. There are some exceptions where you can make that happen with a lot of pre-planning and substantial budgets, but mostly, no, it's just not possible. But the approach that Google Surveys uses does make it possible to gather valid and reliable data from a census rep sample in 3 days, which is also a good reminder. They have billions of people being processed through their search engines every day, and it takes them 3 days to deliver 300 census rep Americans for my survey, which is to say, please trust me when I say anything faster or bigger is probably no good. So the timing for each question and post in our campaign went like this. A few days up front to brainstorm and draft 10 questions. Then for each question, we would take 1 day to finalize the question, make sure we are happy with it. Then launch the survey question and let it gather responses over the course of 3 days. You'll notice the source documentation at the bottom of each graphic notes the 3 days we were in field. Google Surveys will not go faster than that. Then 1 day to look at the results, build the story and the graphics, and then out the door it goes. We staggered this process so that every 2 business days we had another graphic coming out, which made our full campaign of 10 questions last through an entire month. One thing I also wanted to mention about this survey question and the story that comes out of it is that this is one of those uncommon survey questions where a not sure option is really important, and it becomes essential to the story. At first, we thought of articulating the story as just 1/3 of Americans see corporations stepping up to help, but seeing that 42% are not sure forced us to really temper that and say most Americans are not yet seeing corporations step up. And what that means is that there is still time. You can still step up. The jury is out. The third post in this series is about American Sign Language interpreters. And what I want to highlight here is the possibility for really fast and agile responsiveness as events unfold. We had decided that we wanted one of our posts to have a kind of giving back content, meaning it was not just about COVID and about our ability to measure consumer sentiment, but something that would be a public service for a unique community. We chose this topic because I personally use American Sign Language to help me. And then very quickly, as COVID progressed, there was a lawsuit in New York State. New York was one of only 2 states in the entire country not offering real-time, in-screen ASL translation of briefings. As soon as we heard about this lawsuit, we moved this one up in our schedule. We nailed down exactly how we wanted to word the question and envisioned how it could be relevant and helpful no matter how the numbers came out. We were able to circulate these findings very soon after a federal judge in New York issued an emergency order requiring ASL translations at all of the governor's public health briefings. So launching a campaign like this with ideas generated upfront and then a continual rollout of fieldwork and data collection designed to take just 5 days from start to finish means that you can really stay on top of trends and important shifts. You can pivot your content, and you can release your findings to be responsive to that. Number 4, keep your focus broad and general. And if you're going to use a tool like Google Surveys and you want to keep the cost down, you'll have no choice. Broad and general means you need to write questions that everyone can answer, all general population adults. This is a huge limitation, with some caveats I'll mention in just a minute, of using Google Surveys, and it's the reason the tool is mostly not useful for 99.9% of survey work. In the example I'm showing you now, it might have been interesting, for example, if we could have asked only married people how their relationship was faring. But instead, we had to think of a question that would apply to everyone. Hence, it's about family or friends, which include spouses, and it's also not about relationships, but about discussions that become arguments or hurt feelings. Now, I will say this. It is a real challenge, and a fun challenge, actually, to figure out how you can get specific data you need or want from one question that every adult can answer. If you're curious, ask me afterwards about a one-question survey we did for something completely different to measure the number of years people have been divorced. That was quite a fun challenge, and I felt proud that we figured out a clever way to get data for some weighting targets we needed that no government or academic research had available. Now, the caveats I should mention are, first, you can actually do some very limited narrowing, but the ways in which you can narrow have never been of value to my work, and I doubt they are valuable to most. The second caveat is that you can actually use filtering and screening questions to narrow your audience. But as soon as you do that with Google Surveys, your cost per complete goes up more than tenfold, which means the cost of using the tool starts approaching the cost of other tools and sample sources we like to use, which are far, far more flexible. So the primary reason to use Google Surveys is that it is ridiculously cheap. The surveys I run through them cost just 10 cents per complete, but to keep a survey at that price point, you have to be really creative about keeping everything targeted to a general adult population audience. For the fifth piece of our campaign, we wanted to ask something about planning, because there was so much talk about how various local, state, and federal governments were stepping in, or not stepping in, to control and plan for the virus and the economic impact it would have. This was really hard because the question was complex, and Google Surveys absolutely does not allow for complexity. It has a limited number of question types, and there is no way to customize or alter them with HTML like you can with other survey tools. It has a strict limit of just 175 characters and spaces in the question text and 44 characters for the text of each possible answer. The question you are looking at here is right at the limit with 171 characters. If you choose the multiple response type question, the none of the above option is shown automatically, and it cannot be suppressed or have customized text. And yet we wanted to know if they had any plans, and then if they did have plans, who they have talked with about those plans, knowing that probably a lot of people had no plans, and then even if they did, probably a lot of them have not talked about it. So this question took a lot of experimentation with wording and format, and it took a lot of forethought about how we would report it, because having no plans and having a plan but keeping quiet would get lumped into the same none of the above bucket. The lesson learned here is to stick with it, experiment, but stay flexible. Try out different question types and design workarounds like we did here to see if there are different ways to get at what you are after. Probably there is, but it won't be obvious, and it will not be as simple as when you have more powerful tools at your disposal. This next one illustrates what might be the most important piece of advice I always have for any type of campaign, high budget or low budget, as well as any type of internal market research for strategy or operations, anything. And that advice is this: don't display data, tell a story. In a lot of the survey results I saw being circulated by other companies, I noticed tons of charts and graphs. Now, these always grab my attention because I'm interested in data visualization, but a lot of them were pretty terrible, and even if they weren't terrible, a lot of them had nothing to say. The charts and graphs were not telling a story, which they absolutely need to do if you use one. So you will notice by the time I get to the end of this presentation that we used only one chart in our series of 10 survey findings for this campaign. For the rest of the findings, we use iconography and numbers, and we use numbers as graphical elements for interest, but not as a way of displaying data. Why? Because a chart is an invitation to look at data, and what I wanted to do for most of our findings was to tell a story that is simply backed by data. In this example, my goal was to tell a quick story about the impact of isolation as people stopped eating out, some people eating healthier, some people eating worse, lots of people baking, people no longer going to gyms, looking for alternative ways to work out and get exercise. The story I wanted to tell here was about 1 in 4 Americans gaining weight. All by itself, that strikes me as important and relevant. Showing a chart by way of visual comparison would have pulled attention to the numbers of Americans losing or maintaining weight. And while I need to be transparent and report that data, I can do so in a way that still keeps focus on the story I need to tell. Here's something really strange and interesting about the Google Surveys tool we used for this campaign. It uses artificial intelligence, and that AI may block you from launching a survey. It happened to us, which made me realize early on that we not only had to have our ideas locked and loaded to keep moving quickly, but also for each survey, we should be launching at least 1 or 2 days ahead of our target date, then hitting pause right away, and then resuming on that target date, because the AI robot might stop us in our tracks otherwise. My advice to you is to launch and pause ahead of time. Here's exactly what happened and what we did. For the survey we ran about planning that I showed you 2 slides ago, the question starts out, suppose you get COVID-19. Well, that triggered the robot, which sent us a rather snarky robot email, which I will read verbatim. Surveys that request information related to certain medical topics are a non-starter. Question 1 asks about getting a COVID-19. In this scenario, we must reserve the right to allow or not allow surveys with these topics at our sole discretion. Please note that surveys related to medical or health topics are temporarily suspended until further notice. Please remove or edit the question to make it compliant. Now, I thought this was fascinating. First of all, to think about why Google surveys would want to prohibit survey questions about medical or health issues. I have some ideas, but that would be another discussion. But I was also mad because we were not asking about health. We were asking about people's plans for a hypothetical scenario. I ended up talking to a real person at Google Surveys and did get the issue resolved, but the whole process knocked us 1 day off of our schedule. So our strategy for each of the subsequent survey questions, especially like this one that specifically referenced COVID-19, was to design the questions and submit them for launch ahead of time. Let the robot do its work, troubleshoot as needed, and then as soon as we get notification that the survey has launched, hit the pause button and resume on our target date. I mentioned earlier that adding a filter or screening question will make the cost of a survey go up by at least 1,000%. The more general issue to be aware of is that a Google survey is cheap only if you ask one and only one question. So that is what you need to do. Why then am I showing you 2 questions here? To demonstrate a workaround. I really wanted a campaign post that would contrast people's worry about getting sick for themselves versus others. But I couldn't think of a great way to consolidate that into a single question. The standard way to measure this would be to ask about one, then the other, or to include 2 items in a grid. The thing is, if I ask just one question or include 1 line in a grid, my cost per complete is 10 cents. If I ask 2 questions or include 2 lines in a grid, my cost suddenly jumps to $1 per complete. Given my shoestring budget, there is no way I wanted to pay $300 for a sample of 300 respondents to answer these 2 questions, especially considering that I had managed to ask all my previous questions for just $30 each. So what's a researcher to do? Split the 2 questions onto 2 separate surveys. I did not have the same 300 people answering each question, but assuming each survey is getting a good representative sample of the population, that doesn't matter. So these 2 questions were asked on 2 separate surveys. Instead of paying $300, the cost comes down to $30 each. And actually, here's a secret worth knowing. As soon as your first survey is done, Google Surveys sends you a coupon worth 50% of what you just spent if you run another survey within the next 7 days. That means my second survey cost $15 instead of $30, bringing my total cost for these 2 questions down to $45. The key to a really cheap Google survey is to figure out a way to ask one and only one question. If you need to ask 2, then split them onto 2 separate surveys. The 9th posting of our campaign is one of my favorites and highlights an important piece of advice for any type of public relations survey you might be conducting, and that is this: keep it personal. What do I mean by that? I mean, don't ask people to answer questions they can't really answer. Questions like, when do you think the pandemic will end? How long do you think it will take for the economy to recover? In reality, general population adults cannot possibly know when the pandemic will end or when the economy will recover, so why ask them? You can, however, ask them about these issues by keeping it personal. How worried are you? What are your biggest fears? Do you have a plan? Who have you talked to about your plan? These are sensible and meaningful questions to ask people in a survey. So for this question, it was the first week of June. Lots of states were reopening, and we wanted to connect to that bigger idea of how long a recovery at the macro level might take. But it had to be done with a personal question. So it was fun for us to brainstorm a compelling way to do that. Now, there were 2 important pieces of our thinking that went into designing this question then. First was setting the context so that respondents would connect their own personal lives to that bigger concept of recovery that we wanted to highlight. And second, we wanted to ensure that our question would apply to any type of respondent and setback they might be experiencing: financial, career, getting sick with COVID, losing a job, buying a house, getting married, going off to college, whatever it might be. In the end, one reason this was a favorite is that I was quite taken aback by this number: 2.5 years on average to recover. I think that really highlights the way in which this pandemic is affecting people on a personal level, and I have not seen other surveys addressing it in quite this way. Finally, here is number 10 for you. Look to the future. By the time we were ready for this final survey, it was already the second week of June. Having launched these questions every 2 days for a month made us super aware of how fast things were changing and how effective this kind of agile method for a PR campaign could be, because a lot of the questions we brainstormed up front just 5 weeks prior felt like they would already be old news and irrelevant. So that convinced us that the last item in our series really had to be global and forward-thinking, and for that we decided to focus on the environment, which we had been noodling over from the start because there were so many interesting news stories about how the lockdown was benefiting the environment, and yet we were seeing backward steps with lots of single-use takeout containers from restaurants, disposable gloves, disposable masks, stores that wouldn't allow personal bags, etc. That is how we landed on this last question and focus for a story. Now, I don't know if you've noticed it yet, but this survey question goes against the advice I just offered you on the previous slide. And I have not decided yet whether we could have done a better job with this question, but I will say that turning this data into a story was tricky because I really don't want people to predict the future. I want to report what people see as the impact of their behavior and the behaviors around them. I think our wording here does that successfully. Also, one last thing to point out. This is the one item in our campaign for which we used a chart. I referenced that earlier. My reasoning here is I did want readers sort of contemplating each data point in comparison to the others and not just focusing on the storyline of half seeing hope. And I guess that's because I see a lot of potential for there being a bigger, richer story here, maybe with a full-blown survey. And I wanted to keep that potential open and not close it off like I sort of did with an earlier story. Let me show you all of what we did now and give a quick rundown on the numbers. 10 posts and stories based on survey findings. To produce that, we designed 11 surveys because, as you may recall, we fielded 2 survey questions to generate a comparison for the piece about how worried people are for themselves and others. For each of these surveys, we had a census rep sample of 300 US adults, which is generally the minimum I recommend and definitely seemed sufficient for the somewhat limited purpose of our campaign. That means in total, we had 3,300 respondents in our surveys. And the direct cost of doing all this was a mere $255. Now, of course, that doesn't cover the fixed cost or value of our time to design the questions, deploy, troubleshoot, think through the findings and the story, and create the graphic materials for public release. But I can tell you that among the 3 of us who worked on this campaign, 2 on the research side and 1 on the graphic design side, we spent about 50 hours total. So if you have those resources, research people and graphics people, all of this can be done for almost no money and for a pretty modest investment of time. I'm going to switch back over to the video now. This really was our first time trying to design a bare bones, super low budget set of surveys for a PR campaign. Typically, we're engaged in efforts much bigger than this, but to my mind, now when people come in and say to me, Joe, we don't have much money. Can we still do something with a quick and dirty survey for PR? The answer might be yes. I know now that it can be done if you can bring together your internal expertise and resources to make it happen. I invite you once again to share your thoughts, ideas, and questions. Please reach out to me. Again, I'm here right now. Feel free to chat. Connect with me during the remaining 45 minutes of the office or get in touch with me afterwards. Thank you again for joining me at the session.